Resident Evil Village is a good game. I want to make that point explicitly clear before I delve into the meat and bones of this review. I have a lot of choice words about this game, and I get the feeling I'm going to ruffle quite a few feathers with them. I have a lot of history with the Resident Evil series. My first game was Resident Evil 4. I explicitly remember coming home from school one day and my oldest brother and dad were sitting in the living room, getting ready to boot up the PS2 and put in a brand new game. I always liked to watch my brothers play games growing up, so I sat myself down next to my father and watched my brother play through the first few chapters of Resident Evil 4. From the moment he took down the first Ganado, I immediately knew I wanted to play the game for myself, but I was forbidden from playing my older brother's consoles, so I just had to lower my head in shame and go back to playing Super Mario Sunshine. Then one day, several months later, I was browsing through YouTube on the family PC, and ended up finding a video of Resident Evil 4 that was slightly different from the rest. I happened to notice at the bottom of the screen that the button prompt showed a green A button rather than the PS2's X button like I had seen in every other video at the time. Without going into too much detail and throwing this video completely off track, I ended up convincing my grandmother to buy me the game for the GameCube, and from that point onward, I became a Resident Evil diehard. I would soon go on to play a bunch of other games from the series over the next decade, all leading up to 2017 when Resident Evil 7 came out. I want to save my full thoughts on 7 for another video, but next to 4, 7 is one of my favorite games in the series. It's truly a masterpiece in my eyes, and after finishing it, I couldn't have been more hyped for the inevitable Resident Evil 8. I remember reading as many articles as I could, passing them along in my small friend circle as we speculated on the many rumors being thrown around about the game. When time finally came for me to play the game on launch day, I prepared to have my mind blown and my spine tingled the same way it was with RE7. It was time to enter the village.
Long ago, a young girl went with her mother to pick berries for her father, who was hard at work. But the forest greeted them with a dark, cold silence, the bushes empty.
I can confidently say that Village has the strongest opening in any Resident Evil game. The Tim Burton-esque storybook tale immediately caught me off guard on my first playthrough, hinting at a shift in the type of horror this game would be going for, much more gothic and fantasy-inspired, closer to something you would see in a Castlevania game. The story tells about a young girl who goes to pick berries with her mother, but ends up venturing into the wilderness on her own, oblivious to the many dangers she'd inevitably face on this journey. It wouldn't be immediately obvious to some people on their first playthrough, but this opening storybook scene acts as foreshadowing, drip-feeding the player bits of information to give them a rough idea of the 5 villains' themes. Near the end of the story, we cut to Mia and Ethan Winters from RE7, reading the story to their infant daughter, Rose. Throughout this entire opening segment, we get to hear and read about what Ethan and Mia have been up to since the events of RE7. The Baker incident from the previous game has, of course, been covered up by the government. Chris Redfield has moved Mia and Ethan to Europe and given them military training. Unsurprisingly, both Ian and Mia are still shaken up from the events of RE7. Ethan is suffering from paranoia, and Mia appears quite emotionally unstable, snapping at her husband from the simplest of questions and sounding quite bitter and fed up with him at times. If you check the bathroom, you can even see that she's taking medication. For what specifically isn't made clear, though I think it's safe to say it has something to do with depression or anxiety. After putting Rose to bed and heading back downstairs, we get to watch another conversation between these two. Just as tense and heated as the previous one, maybe even more so. As I mentioned previously, Ethan has been suffering from paranoia after saving Mia from the Bakers 4 years ago, struggling to move past what happened and appearing displeased with Mia for just trying to let go of the incident. While the two of them engage in a heated argument, they're suddenly interrupted when Mia is shot out of nowhere. Things escalate faster than you can blink, as Mia is mowed down by a hailstorm of gunfire, leaving Ethan in shock and the player in disbelief. These emotions only magnified once a familiar face approaches Ethan and drops one of the many pennies of this twisted plot.
Mia, oh God! Chris? What the hell?
Sorry, Ethan.
No! What? Why?
This moment right here is what I always think back to when Village comes into the conversation. One of the major protagonists in the history of Resident Evil, known for his determination and unstoppable will to put an end to bioterrorism, completely shatters Ethan's world and murders his wife right in front of his eyes. To anyone familiar with this franchise, it would be immediately obvious that this is dramatically out of character for Chris. Your mind might wander to try and come up with a somewhat reasonable explanation for why he would do this. As Ethan helplessly questions why Chris would even do this, he's quickly surrounded by Chris's men and escorted through the house. As if what just happened wasn't bad enough, Ethan's daughter Rose is taken away by Chris and Ethan is knocked out. I vividly remember the emotions I felt during this opening scene. The idea that a beloved character from the series would do something so heinous and unforgivable, completely staining his legacy as the poster hero of Resident Evil. As someone who spent so much time playing RE7, I felt especially sickened at the sight of Mia's corpse, the character you spend the entirety of 7 trying to rescue, only for her to be immediately killed off in the opening of the sequel. Regardless of how you feel in regards to Mia as a character, having her mercilessly slaughtered in her own home by someone she trusted is a sickening thought, especially when you think about how Rose will grow up without her mother, and Ethan has now, for real this time, lost his wife after fighting and clawing his way through hell to save her. This entire setup is shocking in all the right ways, instilling surprise, confusion, disbelief, along with a handful of burning questions that I could not wait to get all the answers to. After Ethan and Rose are taken away, we suddenly cut to Ethan waking up in the snow after an accident occurred with the vehicle that was transporting them. With Ethan determined to track down Chris, we venture through the freezing woods completely defenseless, eventually finding ourselves in the location the name is based on, the Village. Now, I will not be the first one to inform you how much Village borrows from Resident Evil 4. It's one of the least kept secrets in the entire franchise. Anyone familiar with the series could recognize that with their eyes closed, but from this point onwards, I'm going to be making tons of comparisons to 4 for the sake of analysis. It only seems fair, seeing how this game copies countless elements of the latter in the first place. To start, let's examine the Village itself. From the moment Ethan arrives, we can already tell that the Village is in complete disarray. Any sign of immediate life either subtly or forcefully informs you that anyone who was around likely didn't make it out in one piece. Entering any of the houses, you'll quickly come face to face with destroyed beds, ominous writing on the floor and walls, along with blood splatters, painting a grim picture of the villagers' fates. Venturing deeper into the heart of the village, things only continue to get more eerie, the sight of goat heads being strung up along one of the main paths acting as the red carpet to Ethan's second journey through hell. Entering the next unlocked house, we finally get a chance to arm ourselves. This is a minor detail, but the way Ethan handles the knife shows the results of his training with Chris in such a brilliant way. It isn't shoved in your face, explained with a wall of text, just shows a small little detail you pick up on. Even if you happen to miss it the first time, Ethan's handling of various other firearms in the story paints a similar picture, especially when you compare it to RE7. After one of the biggest jump scares in gaming history,
No! Friendly!
we finally get ourselves properly armed while this European villager talks to us with an American accent. After being inhaled through the ceiling, Ethan is then pulled under the floorboards, followed by one of the dumbest lines I've ever heard in a Resident Evil game. And if you know anything about the series, that is no small feat.
Dead body?
Shortly after the fact, we're introduced to Village's main enemy type in the only way a game starring Ethan Winters could do so. This is where we're properly introduced to combat, and to make a long story short, if you're at all familiar with how it worked in RE7, it's more or less the same story here. Where the differences lie in comparison to its predecessor are located within Village's enemy design and progression system. I'll go into detail about the latter in a moment. For now, let's just focus on what you'll be turning into Swiss cheese for the majority of your playthrough. This is one of the rare aspects of this game that I can single-handedly say with confidence is better than RE7. The main enemies of Village are Lycans, basically the Resident Evil equivalent to a werewolf. On top of being far more aggressive than the moldy Regenerator knockoffs from the previous game, they're also just more interesting, both visually and mechanically. I'm not going to act like they're incredibly designed monsters on their own. If anything, aside from the fact that they're a new classic monster type added into the RE universe, they might as well be humanoid blank slates and not much would be different. That said, comparatively speaking, an easy improvement from 7. The way they constantly dash from side to side can admittedly be annoying to deal with, but it's a minor issue in an otherwise solid enemy type. After dispatching our first Lycan, we make our way into a nearby derelict house, only to find ourselves surrounded once several more Lycans assault the building. I'll just go on ahead and, Shortly after the fact, we manage to hear over the radio that there are in fact other survivors here in the village, prompting us to go out in search of them. Oh look, we run into this house while enemies are in hot pursuit of us, find a shotgun waiting for us, and have to survive a set amount of time while this bigger, scarier enemy chases us around, and the only thing that's our saving grace is the chime of a bell in the distance. Before we can head deeper into the village, Ethan meets a mysterious old woman, and because he has horror game protagonist syndrome, he doesn't get the hint that this crazy bitch is probably best avoided. Ethan soon makes himself known to the rest of the surviving villagers, becoming acquainted with one of them, named Elena. I honestly found their interactions to be a nice change of pace, offering some kind of comfort amidst all the gloom and despair in the village. The father, on the other hand...
Took your damn time.
Frankly, I wanted to toss him over the fence and offer him to the Lycans as a sacrifice. Helping Elena and her father by opening the gate to Louise's house, our efforts on trying to get someone to answer the door ends up getting us a shotgun to the face, only stopped by Louisa intervening and allowing us in.
For God's sake, Julian, let us in.
No, they'll smell the blood. You'll endanger us all.
My father will die out here.
That's not my problem.
Bro, I will throw you over the fence too. The remaining villagers all decide to say a prayer because religion is basically their only option at this point, which Ethan recognizes as the same prayer the old woman from earlier was muttering. This, along with what Elena says to us prior to entering the house, informs the player of someone named Mother Miranda, the lord of the village. There's a bit of a nitpick I have with this, and to understand what I mean, listen to what Elena says about her.
It doesn't make any sense. Mother Miranda has always protected us.
So Mother Miranda has been a guardian for the villagers, but the way Elena speaks about her implies that's no longer the case? If anything, it makes it sound like Miranda herself is responsible for what's happened to the village. On its own, this is a perfectly fine setup. The idea of a powerful authority figure that's watched over and protected you and your friends suddenly flipping the coin and trying to hurt you is a scary thought. I typically find horror stories to be scariest when they take something familiar and comforting and make it the exact opposite. It's simple, but it works. Where I take issue with this plot point is when the villagers all still decide to pray to Mother Miranda, or at least keep her name in the prayer. If she's the one responsible for committing genocide on your village, why are you praying to her? Before I get too far ahead of myself, I want to offer some quick praise for Village's world building here. In comparison to the game it's trying so desperately to imitate, the inclusion of non-infected villagers struggling to survive is a nice touch, especially since the scene of them all arguing feels very accurate to how anyone would react in this kind of situation. The only problem is... They all die immediately after the fact, barely on screen for 10 minutes, and leaving barely any impact on the story. Now look, I'm not going to sit here and act like I expected them all to survive. This is a horror game we're talking about here, but killing them off so quickly after first being introduced the way they were feels like a bit of a waste to me. I'd hardly classify this as a major flaw with the game, but I do find it a bit peculiar. Understandably, after watching even more people die right in front of him, Ethan doesn't take the situation very well.
Why is everyone dying on me? This is just too much. I just don't get it.
This scene has always felt very powerful to me, and acts as a perfect representation of Ethan's character development since his first appearance in RE7. In the previous game, Ethan was much more of a blank slate, most likely an intentional decision by the developers to help welcome newcomers to the series, since 7 could be considered a soft reboot. Outside his determination to find his wife Mia, Ethan isn't shown to have much of a personality. He's portrayed as just some random civilian who's dragged into a survival situation. The issue with creating a character like this lies in the developers expecting the player to imprint themselves on the protagonist. This creates a big problem if your so-called player insert character is already desynced from the one controlling them. There's a reason why most games that feature this type of character allow the player to customize their name, appearance, and choices throughout their adventure. The immersion of placing yourself in the shoes of the protagonist, role-playing in the world to build your own story, is what makes these games so special. So when you look at Ethan, a character who already has a name, his own motivations, and makes his own choices, most players aren't going to want to be placed in his shoes. They're going to want to see him as his own character. And when you see and hear how Ethan reacts to many of the perils he faces in the Baker household, there's a great chance that any immersion you may have had up to this point is completely shattered.
What the fuck? Well, that's special.
For your horror game to maximize instilling fear in the player, the character you're controlling needs to share said fear. When Ethan is facing these truly horrific-looking monsters and he just drops these casual, witty one-liners, it just creates confusion and kills any realism. Now before any of you jumped down my throat about realism in Resident Evil, let me explain. I'm well aware this is a series about stupidly over-the-top monsters with a long history of action set pieces and one-liners galore, so realism should never be at the very top of the priority list for the developers. But it's where the devs implement said realism that enhances the immersion. If I were to ask you right now, what part of a horror game is the most important to get right, some of you may say story, others would suggest things like audio or atmosphere, but I'm sure a lot of you would say something along the lines of making the player uncomfortable. To get to the point I'm trying to make here, Ethan's reactions in RE7 do not match the circumstances he's found himself in. He's way too wooden and stale, which is why many players either didn't like him or just didn't care much about him. Moving back to this scene and comparing it to everything we saw with Ethan in 7, it finally shows us that Ethan has developed his own character. We can hear the pain in his voice, his desperation to keep those around him safe, and as he attempts to move on, the sound of defeat echoes in his tone. A short while later, as Ethan attempts to enter the nearby castle, he finds himself confronted by Nicolas Cage Magneto, and after being captured by him, Ethan comes face to face with the 4 lords of the village, along with Mother Miranda, the big bad of this game. I'll go into more detail about each of these lords once we reach their respective sections, but for now, I'll just say this is a neat way to introduce all of them, for no other reason than we get to see how they all interact with one another, and judging from their appearances and mannerisms, it doesn't give obvious flags of what kind of shenanigans the player will deal with once it's time to tackle their sections of the game. After being chased away by a horde of Lycans and barely getting out alive, it's time to tackle Castle Dimitrescu. But first...
I've been waiting for you, Mr. Winters.
Now we can really get into the nitty-gritty of this review. Prepare for the RE4 reference counter to go up a lot from this point forward. The Duke is RE8's version of the Merchant from RE4, and even directly quotes him. An easy 2 points for the counter. I was always a sucker for the Merchant in RE4. The idea of a progression system fits so well with the series, and adding in currency on top of it just created further incentive to take down every enemy in your path, keeping the gameplay engaging and addicting. Too bad they fucked it up! This is my first big issue with Village. The progression system. Traditionally in the Resident Evil games, you start out with a knife and pistol, and over the course of the game, you gradually find stronger and stronger weapons that compensate for the enemies getting tougher and scarier. By the time you get to the endgame, you're practically a one-man army, capable of mowing down anything in your path on the way to the final boss. I've always felt this was a simple, satisfying way to make you feel like you're growing stronger over the course of the game, overcoming that feeling of helplessness at the very beginning. When Resident Evil 4 was being developed, the developers decided to not only keep the progression mechanic from the previous games, but also add in their own spin on it that, in my opinion, truly made it special. On top of being able to use money that you find on your adventure to buy new weapons, you also have the option to upgrade your guns directly, giving them more firepower, higher capacity, faster reloads, etc. Being an already engaging mechanic on its own, this also provides the player with choice. Do they hold on to their current handgun and pump a bit of money into it to make it stronger, or do they save up to buy a new handgun altogether? Every single weapon in RE4 has their own specialties, excelling in areas that their brethren cannot. While you might assume from an initial glance that their stats are what differentiates them from one another, you'd be mostly correct. See, once you've maxed out a weapon's upgrade, you'll then be shown one more upgrade at the bottom of the list. This is the exclusive upgrade. As the name would imply, this final upgrade grants the firearm in question a unique benefit. The handgun, for example, receives a 5 times multiplier to its critical hit chance, letting you pop heads so much more consistently, and saving you a ton of ammo in the process. The Punisher gains the ability to shoot through 5 targets at once, opening up the chance for insane enemy staggers and melee attacks. The Blacktail and Red 9 get massive increases to their firepower, creating a difficult choice between the Red 9's raw power or the Blacktail's faster handling and much higher capacity. I'm aware that like 90% of players don't bother with the handgun or Punisher, so this might sound like a moot point, but my overall point here is that each gun has a role to play. They excel at different things, and most importantly to me, encourage replayability. I replay Resident Evil 4 several times a year, and each time I do, I make slight modifications to my loadout. On my most recent playthrough, I decided to stick to the base shotgun and rifle, along with the Punisher, because I wanted to try a playstyle that I never even attempted before, and because of that, it made my playthrough feel fresh. Village, on the other hand, does not have this feature, and it absolutely kills the progression system. The lack of an exclusive upgrade for the game's numerous firearms is already a big red flag, but what truly pounds the nail in this coffin is the knowledge of the various guns all following a straightforward power creep. I mentioned earlier how most Resident Evil games gradually introduce stronger weapons to the player over the course of the game, something that Village emulates very well. You may be asking yourself, well, if Village just does the same thing as the other games and you don't have a problem with the mechanic outside of Village, why is it suddenly bad here? I'll tell you why. Because every single new weapon you find is more or less statistically superior to the ones that come before it, and makes upgrading your weaker guns a blatant waste of money. Why bother upgrading the firepower on your dinky little handgun when there's probably a stronger one waiting for you right around the corner that's objectively superior? It makes me wonder why the upgrade system is even here if it only matters for 1/3 of the game's firearms. Well, outside of copying its superior older brother, that is. I can already hear some of you typing down in the comments, and I know what's coming. But doesn't Resident Evil 4 also have blatantly superior weapons that make the others obsolete? What's the difference here? Look, I'm not going to deny the superiority of certain guns over others in RE4. The riot gun, for example, is just an upgraded shotgun with no downsides. No one would deny that. But like I explained earlier, the exclusive upgrades help keep each gun unique and give a reason to hold on to them. Hell, some weapons are unique even without the exclusive upgrade. Let's take these two guns as an example, the riot gun and the striker. The striker does more damage than the riot gun, easily has a better capacity, a faster fire rate, and takes up a lot less space in your inventory. On paper, the striker looks unequivocally superior, but when you actually use the two weapons in game, you see the bigger picture. Firstly, notice how Leon holds these weapons. The riot gun is held against his shoulder, while the striker is positioned against his hip. This makes it much trickier to aim for headshots with the striker. In addition, let's compare how they function in mid-range combat. If you'll notice, the riot gun is much more effective from a distance than the striker because it has a much tighter pellet spread. You could argue that this doesn't really matter much, since shotguns are meant for close-range combat only anyway, but no matter which way you spin it, getting close to an enemy is dangerous. The more space we put between them and the player, the better. That's why popping heads with the sniper rifle is so overpowered in this game. In any case, with this in mind, it paints a clearer picture of how these two weapons are more balanced than initially perceived. Of course, everyone is going to have their own personal preferences of which one they think is better, but it's down to personal opinion. In Village, however, it's just a fact most of the time that a majority of the guns are rendered completely obsolete once you get your hands on the new ones. The only downside to keeping the stronger guns is having to spend much more money to upgrade them, but that's a small price to pay for the increased firepower. Sure, you can make an argument about limiting yourself to weaker guns for a self-imposed challenge, but the only thing that changes is the difficulty. Whereas in RE4, like I mentioned previously, you get a different gameplay experience that goes beyond just a one-sided shift in difficulty. There is absolutely nothing wrong with having a linear progression system, but when you're blatantly replicating a mechanic from the most popular and well-received game in the same series, you need to emulate what made it so good in the first place, or at the very least make it distinct with a similar level of quality. Alright, with that out of the way, let's focus on the Duke. I actually really like him as a character. He fits perfectly with the game's theme and even has his own distinct personality separate from the merchant in RE4. Though in all fairness, the merchant didn't really have a personality outside his handful of iconic lines and the mystery surrounding him. Duke adopts the same mysterious aura, his demeanor and mannerisms very professional but suspicious at the same time, topped up with a charismatic personality. Seeing him actually interact with Ethan over the course of the game adds a lot not just for his character, but for Ethan as well. I'll go into more detail about this a bit later. For now, let's discuss the first major level of the game, Castle Dimitrescu. First things first, our protagonist transfers from a gritty village to a gothic castle. Here we go. Now I'm sure everyone is already decently familiar with this place, as it was all over the marketing for this game. And of course, once gamers got their greasy, Cheeto-fingered hands on Village, the goon apocalypse began. You couldn't go anywhere on the internet without seeing at least one person simping over Lady D. It surpassed being a trend and frankly turned into an obsession. Then when the game finally came out, well... Alright, let me not get ahead of myself here. The castle section of Village is, in my opinion, one of the strongest sections in the game, both in terms of theming and level design. Despite sharing a lot in common with the castle level from its older brother, it contrasts the former just enough for it to be distinct, while also giving veterans of the series a nostalgic vibe. Not long after entering the castle, Ethan is cornered by 3 bug ladies who forcefully drag him to Lady Step on Me, revealing her as the mother. One thing I want to point out about this scene, aside from Ethan's hands continuing to prove themselves as the strongest Resident Evil characters, is how Lady D and her daughters are revealed to be cannibals. Back when this game was being promoted, this section of the game was showcased heavily. With the reveal of werewolves being part of the game, many of us assumed that Lady D and her daughters were going to be vampires, when in actuality, they're not. In all fairness, I don't think there was anything official that explicitly stated they were vampires. It was all assumptions based on the supposed theme of the game, showcased in the trailers, so I'm not going to hold it against Village, but I felt like pointing it out regardless. Not long after Ethan makes his escape, he ends up being chased by one of the daughters, jumping down a pit and ending up in the dungeons of the castle. The change in tone and scenery here is fast, almost too fast. It's as if the game suddenly remembered it's supposed to be a horror game and flipped a switch in less than a second. Remember this for later. Moving that aside though, the atmosphere here is absolutely on point. To be fair, it isn't difficult to make these kinds of settings eerie by default, but what elevates these dungeons above the standard for me is the solid environmental storytelling, both from a visual and written standpoint. Just walking through the dungeons and seeing all these medieval torture devices stained with dried blood paints a grisly picture of how savage the residents of the castle are. You can read a journal entry that talks about how a maid who made a simple mistake got their face cut with a knife by one of the daughters, and later on the writer of the journal says she opened up a window after the daughters spoke about it being too stuffy in the castle, only to have them all shriek at her to close it immediately. I like this file especially because it tells us a lot with the little, how volatile and malevolent the women of the castle are, and some light foreshadowing of what it takes to bring the daughters down. The dungeons are also where we're introduced to a new enemy type, the Moroika. Quite frankly, these guys are complete pushovers. Their movements are much more sluggish compared to Lycans, and their attacks are fairly well telegraphed, making it easy to block in time. Plus, I also just think they aren't that scary. I realize that's easily the most subjective thing about them, but I thought I'd just throw that out there anyway. Before I talk about the upcoming boss fight, I want to bring attention to this door. One thing I always really enjoyed about Resident Evil 4 was the occasional optional backtracking to get yourself some hidden treasure, and this is something that Village does really well. I'd argue even better than the former. For one, the backtracking in this game feels much less tedious. The exact reason why is something I'll be getting into shortly. Secondly, there's many more places to search for hidden treasures. They always tend to catch your eye while exploring, taking a mental note in the back of your mind to come back and investigate later. It creates this avid excitement as you speculate to yourself on what could be waiting for you once you have the key to open up that part of the map, and Village is anything but disappointing when it comes to its rewards. I recognize that backtracking as a game mechanic is very polarizing in the community, and even those who are in favor of it don't exactly sing its praises very often. In most cases, it's a matter of hating it or tolerating it. Loving it is quite rare to see, at least in my experience. In my opinion, I feel like the deciding factor on whether or not a game's backtracking is done well is the light at the end of the tunnel, how long and treacherous the tunnel is, and if it's required or optional. As I mentioned before, the rewards you get for backtracking in Village are often well worth the detour, either rewarding you with treasures, weapons, or something else which I'll get into shortly. These sections also aren't that out of the way for you to go down. They blend in seamlessly with the level design and never outstay their welcome. I especially love how a lot of these are puzzle rooms. It adds an extra layer of satisfaction when you solve them and claim your prize. I remember one of the last ones the most fondly, where you have to light a torch that's too far away from the radius of the swinging lamp, so the solution is to light one of the enemies on fire, lowering them to the torch so they can light it for you. The puzzles in Resident Evil games may not be Silent Hill levels of complexity, but they're still satisfying to solve most of the time. I'm not really sure how to transition back to Castle Dimitrescu, so I'll just start with the boss fight against one of the daughters, Bella. This acts as a warm-up fight of sorts, showing the player how exposing them to the cold makes it so they can be harmed. Once any of the daughters become vulnerable to attacks like this, they really don't pose any kind of threat and go down quickly. In the next room, we then stumble upon a customizable part for Ethan's handgun that gives it more firepower. There are many of these sprinkled throughout the game, some sold by the Duke, and others in well-hidden areas that we can stumble across. As much as I want to say how much I love this idea and concept, it's unfortunately held down by the game's lackluster weapon diversity. Now to be fair, in the specific instance, there isn't any downside to strapping this compensator on your handgun, seeing how you won't be getting another one until much later, and a first-time player wouldn't be privy to the knowledge about this game's weapon system at this point in the game anyway. I'll refrain from ranting any more than I need to for the time being, and focus back on the castle. Once you dispose of Bella and get your hands on the blood wine, the castle really begins to open up. Using the blood wine, we're able to obtain a key that leads us out into the courtyard, and then from the courtyard up to Lady Dimitrescu's quarters, where we end up finding out very quickly that she isn't too pleased with us.
What have you done to my daughter?
Normally, I'm not a big fan of jump scares in any kind of media. They're a really cheap way to get a big reaction out of someone and, in most cases, don't really elicit any real fear in the first place. Being startled isn't the same as being fearful. The moment you hear Dimitrescu angrily mourning over her daughter, not only is it startling, but it also makes the player feel like they're in deep water. She's just down the hall in the next room. For all you know, she could bust down the wall and immediately attack us. It freezes you in place for a moment as your paranoia runs rampant. This is how you do jump scares effectively. It isn't super loud, in your face, and blowing out your eardrums with scary noises. It's just a milder, heart-skipping jump of noise from a nearby room that paints a picture of your inevitable confrontation with the Lord of the Castle. Carefully tiptoeing our way down the hall and into the only unlocked door, we solve a simple puzzle and unlock the entrance to the wine cellar. I'm not sure if this is me, but I feel like any attempts to make this area unsettling just didn't land whatsoever. Nothing really noteworthy to say about this part, so let's just skip ahead a bit. Ethan eventually manages to sneak his way up to a window and somehow avoids being spotted by Lady D in a way that I can't even explain other than just sheer plot armor. Like, seriously, I know she's super tall, but she couldn't even see him in her peripheral vision? Not even a little? Anyway, Lady D ends up receiving a call from Mother Miranda, and the two of them talk about Ethan and the importance of some ceremony. From what we're able to gather, it sounds as if it's important for Ethan to still be alive for the ceremony, something Miranda is quick to remind Lady D about in the middle of her threat. Unfortunately for us, it doesn't look like she's willing to play by Miranda's rules, and storms off to hunt us down. While it may look like we're safe for the time being, the moment we snatch the Dimitrescu key and attempt to peace out, Lady D hits us with a
"Surprise, motherfucker!"
and proceeds to give every degenerate who played this game their ultimate fantasy.
Touch me.
What the hell, dude? Ah!
You ungrateful, selfish wretch! You come into my house!
Touch me harder.
You lay your filthy man hands on my daughters! And now you even try to steal my property!
This scene basically acts as the catalyst to transition the castle section into its second phase, if you will. While attempting to find his way out of the dungeon, Ethan is lent a hand by Lady D, and we have to run away from her and survive, Nemesis style. From this point onward, Dimitrescu will act as the Mr. X of the castle, always on the move and tracking you down relentlessly. I don't think this would come as a surprise to anyone, but Dimitrescu is nowhere near as scary as intimidating as Mr. X or Nemesis, especially the former. and I feel like missing this crucial element to a stalker enemy type ruins a lot of what makes them good in the first place. Sure, the threat of death is always present, and a way to intimidate the player and encourage them to stay on the move, but when that's all you offer, it can feel a bit hollow as a mechanic, at least in a horror game setting. So as Dimitrescu is tracking us down, we have to find 4 masks to escape the castle, 2 of which being guarded by the remaining daughter still roaming the castle. Unfortunately, the boss fights against both the daughters are rather boring. For one of them, you're trapped in a library, and the only way to make her vulnerable is to open the sunroof. On a first playthrough, you might end up running around in a panic trying to find a way to break the glass while you're constantly overwhelmed with flies assaulting your screen. But once you find the switch that opens the sunroof, the fight, well, it doesn't become a fight anymore. The sunroof doesn't stay open permanently, so it gives you the illusion that you need to make good use of your time and get in as many shots as possible while it's open. Until you realize that the lever to open said roof has no cooldown, so there's practically zero risk of danger in this encounter whatsoever. It's really quite baffling. The last daughter fight is thankfully much better in comparison, but still weak overall. You have to use an explosive to blow up the wall and create an opening that leads to the outside, thus making her vulnerable. And as with the previous 2 encounters, she hardly puts up a fight without her flies doing the heavy lifting. By this point in the castle, we basically have all the necessary tools needed to find the 4 masks that will allow Ethan to leave, and chances are for some of you, the last mask you acquire will most likely be the one on the roof of the castle, where we snag ourselves a stupidly overpowered rifle that'll be doing most of the heavy lifting in Ethan's arsenal. Unfortunately, this warm welcome of familiarity has its impact tainted by the next enemy type we encounter in the next room. These flying bastards are called Samka, and boy are they a pain in the ass. Flying enemies are by no means anything new to Resident Evil, they've been around since the very first game, but the reason Samka are so annoying has to do with a couple different factors. For starters, there seems to be something seriously wrong with the way controller dead zones work in Village. If you pay attention to my gameplay footage towards the beginning of the game, you may notice that I have Xbox controller prompts on my screen that inexplicably change to keyboard prompts later on. This is because I had a very hard time aiming with a controller. It felt like no matter what settings I adjusted, I couldn't get the dead zone to work the way I wanted it to. This may just sound like a skill issue to some of you, but I have absolutely no issues aiming with a controller in all the other RE Engine games. It's specifically and only Village that gives me this much trouble. So for the remainder of my playthrough I ended up using mouse and keyboard, making things significantly more comfortable, until I got to the Samka. These things are the purest definition of annoying. The way they erratically dart from side to side with no easily discernible pattern makes taking shots way more of a hassle than it needs to be. And the noises they make, good God, the noises. This is basically the video game equivalent of that one scene in Dumb and Dumber. The only difference here being that you can hear it multiple times throughout the game and you can't skip it. Fun. Anyway, after obtaining your last mask and placing all 4 of them in their respective pedestals, we're finally able to leave the castle. Kinda. Ethan makes his way into a dilapidated church. Removing the top of a coffin in the very back, we find a special dagger that was actually foreshadowed back in the attic of the castle. The first time I got to this part, I actually thought this would be a knife upgrade or something. But unfortunately, after being caught by Lady D and stabbing her with the blade... yeah. Oh well. I like to imagine that every single Lady D simp had a reaction akin to something like this while watching this scene. I can say with confidence that not a single soul on this planet saw this coming. At least in regards to the horrific transformation. Not the idea of her transforming at all, mind you, but the sheer difference in... eye candy, if you will. Resident Evil bosses have always had undergone horrific mutations for sure. This is nothing new, but you have to remember just how heavily this character was shown off in the game's marketing. Lady Dimitrescu was everywhere. A large factor of why this game got so much publicity was the overwhelming amount of simp posting from the people online. This is the catalyst that marks the beginning of Resident Evil Village's hard, downward spiral. The boss fight itself is perfectly fine, You basically just run around in a circle on this tower to avoid attacks and occasionally snipe her out of the air when she flies around the tower. I would hardly call this a brain-dead boss fight, but it is very simple and straightforward. I honestly don't have too much to say about it. The second phase is arguably even more simple. You just run up these stairs and have to fight her in an enclosed space where dodging is all but impossible. It basically just boils down to endlessly mash the fire button and occasionally guard. Nothing more, nothing less. After winning the fight and surviving a fall that should have turned Ethan into paste, we get one of the lamest one-liners ever muttered by a Resident Evil protag.
You're the one who's cursed.
Anyway, as we attempt to leave, we find this mysterious flask sitting on a platform, and right as Ethan picks it up, I assumed he activated an Indiana Jones trap and was going to fall through a trapdoor onto a bed of spikes. Thankfully, it just opens up the exit, and we find ourselves traversing through a pathway in the mountain, running into a familiar face.
The crests of the four bloodlines may open the path you seek.
Will you please stop talking in riddles? I just want to find my daughter.
It's only a riddle if you don't know the answer.
I've always had a pet peeve with these kinds of characters in any type of media. The whole, I'm only going to talk in convoluted poems and not explain anything characters. I don't hate the concept on its own, I think it can be done well, but 99% of the time I just think it's done to make characters more artificially mysterious and unsettling, and this old bitch is no exception. As we exit the cave, some may notice the mysterious symbol resting in the center of this heavy ritualistic environment. I wonder what it is.
There you are. I had a feeling you would pop up here.
It was all worthless.
Is that so? I assume you've picked up something of value.
Not sure if it's of value, but...
Why, you have your daughter right in your own hands.
What are you saying?
Take a closer look. That flask seems to contain her head.
No. What?
Roses.
Don't say another word! This is impossible! This just can't be!
This is another scene in the game that I think is absolutely fantastic. It elicits the same shock and disbelief that the opening scene with Chris gunning down Mia does. Upon rewatching them both back to back for this review, I noticed that they both flow identically as well. They start out perfectly normal, giving the illusion of safety with a friendly face interacting with Ethan, only for concern to creep its way into the player's mind once things begin to go downhill. Then, the bombshell. Ethan's frustrated confusion follows right after, his emotions targeted at the immediate person in his vicinity, only instead of Chris forcibly capturing Ethan, the Duke seemingly attempts to help Ethan by explaining that Rose can be saved if he follows his instructions. The very idea that Rose's head was removed and shoved into a jar is a particularly brutal one, even by Resident Evil standards. This is a baby we're talking about here, and not a mutated monster one either. Yes, it's implied that Rose has special powers, but my point is that Rose isn't some fleshy nightmare creature. She looks just like a normal baby, which makes this information all the more shocking. Now, I use the word normal here a bit loosely, seeing how Duke mentions Rose having powers. What these powers are exactly remains to be seen, but if she's still alive after having her head shoved into a jar, it looks like they're quite potent. Duke instructs Ethan to make his way to a house with a red chimney in the village before he'll explain more about the situation, something Ethan is understandably displeased with, but seeing how his options are quite limited, he reluctantly goes along with it. This is where we're allowed to search through the village to our heart's content, not just for the sake of progressing the plot, but also to scratch the player's itch for exploration and discovering goodies. The village is basically devoid of life at this point outside the lichens, not another human soul in sight, which helps add tension, while at the same time giving me some slight disappointment. I'll reiterate that I didn't expect the village to be completely full of life. I knew it was going to be empty for the most part, but I still feel like the scene at Louise's house got rid of all the villagers too quickly. We also end up finding a new pistol that's unquestionably better than our old one. No reason to touch it ever again. In any case, we make our way to the house, grab a key, and then go back to the Duke, who proceeds to tell us about the four lords of the village: Lady Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento, Moreau, and Heisenberg, each lord holding one of Rose's flasks. Before I continue, I want to point out something really quick. I mentioned previously how Lady D was all over the marketing for Village, an obvious tactic by Capcom to magnify the game's hype. Whether or not you agree with such a ploy is over to the side. Rather, I wish to point out how this ended up hurting Village rather than helping it. At this point, we're not even halfway through the game and Lady D is already dead, her entire section dedicated to only 1/4 of the game's runtime. I, along with many others, showed confusion at the castle section being much shorter than we anticipated. The first and third trailers for the game, along with the various social media advertisements from Capcom, definitely made the castle look much more significant than it actually was, which ended up giving a lot of players whiplash after it was over so quickly. As the Duke explained earlier, there are four lords of the village, Lady D being one of them, so it just seems very odd to me that the trailers would give 95% of the spotlight to only one of them, and only briefly show one of the other lords for like 3 seconds. I understand that they probably didn't want to show too much in their trailers, as most of them never show anything significant past the castle segment anyway, but this just had the unintended consequence of pulling the rug out from under the player's feet. To play fair for a second though, I don't want to put all the blame on Capcom, because I have to wonder, if they had chosen to show off one of the other lords' sections in the trailers and advertised it as much as the castle, would the whiplash be just as bad? The internet plays an important role in generating hype, and I can't overlook the possibility that this aspect of the game being overhyped by the internet is just as much a factor as the advertisements from Capcom. So, who's really at fault here? It's impossible to say for certain, but either way, it didn't do any favors for Village. After Duke's exposition about the four lords, we enter the second section of the village. The entire area is coated in a thick, white fog. There isn't a single enemy in sight, and the path is decorated with dolls. Then...
Ethan...
What?
we have officially entered the scary segment of the game. This is basically just one giant hallway with occasional hallucinations of Mia to mess with Ethan. On my first playthrough of this segment, I was completely invested. Not because it's super spooky or anything, more so the intrigue of what was coming, along with the change in tone. There is more I want to say about this, but I'll save it for the end of this section. We eventually make our way to the Beneviento house, which ends up being eerily empty. This is a small detail, but I like how quiet things are in the house. There's no creepy music or unsettling visuals. It leaves you alone with your thoughts and paranoia, constantly making you fear something around the corner that may or may not exist. After taking an elevator down to the basement and reaching the back room, yeah, no smart individual would fall for this. But the game must go on, so...
I've been waiting for so long. I'd make a much better daughter than Rose. Please, won't you stay with me forever?
What? Wait, where's my gun?
This section is awesome. We basically have an entire floor of puzzles to solve, while soaking in the unsettling atmosphere. Resident Evil puzzles have always been one of my favorite things about the series. They've never really been complex or convoluted, but that's part of why I like them so much. They don't end up being major pace breakers, just something to take your mind off the horror for a minute while you do some basic problem solving, while also staying connected to the environment and offering a slightly different matter of unease, much less survival and more critical thinking. However, I will say, this music box puzzle is a little bullshit in my opinion. Call it a skill issue, but I was stuck on this damn thing for like a half an hour on my first playthrough because I had no idea what I was supposed to do. I had to shamefully look up a guide just to progress. Turns out, you're supposed to line up the scratches in order to get the gears to turn, but I honestly didn't even comprehend them until the guide pointed them out for me. I thought they were just there for decoration to show how old it is or something. Aside from that, most of what you have to solve is simple, but satisfactory. Every time you pick up a key item, something in the basement will change, whether it's Mia saying ambiguously creepy things over the radio, paintings on the wall falling over, or flickering lights. But we all know what this section is really about. If you're watching this video, there's practically a 0% chance you don't know. After retrieving an item from the bottom of a well, we come back to this grisly scene. The red light, combined with the bloody umbilical cord that trails into the dark hallway, is incredibly scary. This is just a me thing, but any kind of horror media that revolves around childbirth or babies is especially disturbing to me. so when I saw this for the first time, I felt as cold as a snowman. Traversing down the dark hallway, we come face to face with the creature that has given so many players weeks of nightmares. Do you remember how Capcom said they toned down the horror in Village because people found RE7 to be too scary?
So that was a fucking lie.
In all fairness, tone down doesn't mean remove entirely, but if you ask me, this entire section is way scarier than anything in 7. Because you're unarmed, you're forced to run and hide from this abomination. Getting touched by it is an instant game over. The goal here is to find a fuse needed to access the elevator, which we find in one of the bedrooms. After placing said fuse in the box next to the elevator, we transition into the second phase of the section where we have to play hide and seek with this creepy ass doll. I'm a bit indifferent on this boss fight, if you can even call it that. All you do is run around and try to find where the doll could be hiding. If it wasn't for the clear sound cues you get when you're really close to where she's hiding, this would make for a really annoying encounter on repeat playthroughs. With 3 stabs to the head, we exterminate the doll, only for Ethan to pop back into the real world. Turns out the entire thing was a hallucination. While on the topic, this is a trope that's always confused me no matter what kind of media it appears in. Both in this game and RE7, we see characters get visibly injured from these hallucinations. But if they aren't real, how can they be hurt by them? I realize I'm questioning game logic here, and it isn't nearly as deep as I'm making it out to be, but for me personally, it's a difficult phenomenon to just ignore or brush off. With Donna dead, we grab the second flask and head back to the village. On the way back, we actually find the path littered with enemies. I like to imagine the devs purposely threw us back into a combat environment to let the player blow off some steam after the nightmarish fetus basement. The sentiment is nice, but I was just glad to start looting again. Oh look, a new shotgun. I guess I won't be needing this one anymore. On to section 3 now, and... Okay, I'm not gonna lie, this thing is up there with the Regenerators from RE4 as the scariest enemy in any Resident Evil game. They may not be as unsettling as the Regenerators, but their sheer speed makes me tense and panic like nothing else. Good thing you can completely cheese it by hiding in this house, I guess. Following the green slime, we slice through a huge pile of it and make our way to the windmills. We actually managed to acquire the third flask right away in this level, which really took me by surprise. Unfortunately, Ethan spends too much time hearing out this gross bastard and gets trapped, so we're forced to go find fuel for a boat and traverse across dangerous waters. Ethan finds himself in some kind of research outpost where he's attacked and held at gunpoint. Then...
Ethan! I gotta say, I'm surprised you made it this far. It'd be a shame if something happened to you now.
Sure, Chris. Why not? You killed Mia. Now do me and finish the job.
Hey, Cap. I'm getting some serious motion readings out here. We should move on.
What kind of readings? What's moving?
Unknown, but my guess is we've been here too long, and Miranda knows it.
Hey, did you say Miranda? How are you involved?
Leave it alone, Ethan. You are out of your depth. What about the sample analysis?
It's definitely related to the mold.
You stay out of our business, Ethan. What this garbage?
This is easily one of the most infuriating things I've ever witnessed in a video game story. This cutscene alone was enough to give me motivation to make this video in the first place. Where do I even begin with this? Okay, so Chris and his men gun down Mia at the beginning of the game, break into Ethan's home, kidnap both him and his daughter, and Chris has the absolute gall to tell Ethan to stay out of the situation? Telling Ethan he's out of his depth specifically got my blood boiling more than anything. I tend to get a lot of pushback from people online whenever I express my displeasure with this statement. To a certain extent, I get why, but here's my argument. Ethan says in the beginning segment of the game that he received military training from Chris. We can visually see the effect of said training with how eloquently Ethan handles weapons, and you can even find a book in his office about firearms, implying his commitment to defending himself and his family. Ethan is not the same untrained civilian he was in RE7. His training makes him at least, if not more capable than Leon and Claire from RE2. To address the counter-arguments for a moment, most people who challenge this viewpoint argue that while Ethan is capable of holding his own, he isn't anywhere on the same level as Chris and his men, so it makes sense why Chris doesn't want him involved. I completely understand and also mildly agree with this, but at the same time, you have to remember that Ethan took down Jack and Marguerite in the previous game before he had any kind of training from Chris. On top of this, he also took down the mutated Lady D earlier in the same day, a BOW that would make mincemeat out of anything from RE7. At bare minimum, you'd have to acknowledge that Chris is severely underestimating Ethan here. I'm not going to argue that Chris and Ethan are in the same league, not by a long shot, but Ethan is certainly more than Chris makes him out to be. There's another big reason why I take issue with this interaction, which I'll get into later. Suffice to say, Chris's irritation at Ethan for getting involved is nothing short of asinine. We also encounter Moreau in the same cutscene, but honestly, who gives a shit, dude? I certainly didn't. According to the gross hunchback, the exit is underwater. A big problem for Ethan because Moreau's mutated form is basically a gigantic killer fish. The goal here is to open the dam and drain the water of the lake, but of course it isn't that easy because there's no power. I'll be completely honest, I really don't have much to say about this entire section, primarily because I don't feel one way or the other about it. It's just, eh. Instead of it being combat-based, it's like a platformer. You have to make your way across the lake to reach one of the windmills. In between safe ground are planks of wood, where Moreau can catch Ethan and cause an instant game over. What I like most about this section is finding all the wooden posts you have to shoot to create a path forward. It's simple, but satisfying. I can say with confidence that this is much more replayable than the Beneviento house, but that's really the highest praise I can really offer it. Oh, and since this is a fight against a giant lake monster,
Caught myself a big one.
Ethan, you're never going to be as cool as Leon. Don't even try.
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
After draining the water, we transition into the Moreau boss fight, and I'm sorry, but this fight is just plain annoying. What I'm about to say isn't fact by any means, more so just a personal evaluation. But I think the biggest culprit in why this is so irritating is the first-person perspective, combined with the way movement works in this game. Throw this fight in a Resident Evil game built for third person, it would likely be a lot more tolerable. Moreau just moves way too fast for the player to reasonably keep up. The arena is also a lot more tight than it looks because the boss fills up the entirety of whatever passage he chooses to occupy, so you can't run past him. Imagine playing a game of Pac-Man but in first person and Pac-Man has a gun. That's more or less what this encounter feels like to me. And as if things weren't already sucky enough, Moreau also has a tendency to spew out streams of acid that I swear are next to impossible to avoid consistently. It feels like the acid has pinpoint accurate hitboxes, meaning that even if a small drop hits Ethan at all, you take damage. I should specify that in a vacuum, this isn't an inherent issue, but the problem surfaces when the acid can clip through the environment and hit Ethan when he's supposed to be behind cover. I don't know, maybe this is just a skill issue on my part. It doesn't seem like anyone else has issues with this boss, so I'm willing to accept this is most likely a me issue. To be entirely fair for just a minute, I don't hate this encounter. I'd argue it's probably the strongest boss encounter thus far. I love setting down an entire row of mines and letting Moreau walk right over them for easy damage, plus the mechanic of needing to run under the roof to avoid the acid rain. This guy is also quite tanky. He can soak up a surprising number of bullets before going down, even if you consistently hit his weak spot. Overall, not a terrible fight, but not a great one either. With Moreau defeated, we move forward and grab the final piece of the key.
You're better off than I thought.
Who's that?
Oh, come on. We just met a while back, not that it really matters.
You're the last asshole in my way, aren't you?
You've got fight. I'll give you that, Ethan. But what's the plan when you have all 4 flasks?
What are you trying to get at?
I could lend you a hand.
Not trying to get on my good side?
I don't get cocky. I'd kill you if you weren't worth the trouble. There's a stronghold not too far outside the village. Go there and get my flask. Do that, and you pass. First, head back to the graveyard.
Self-centered prick.
I'm always a sucker for juice plotlines like this. A very pleasant surprise for me on my initial playthrough. Of course, at this time, we have no reason to truly believe Heisenberg is being genuine with Ethan here. It doesn't take much to suspect this would be a trap. Regardless, Ethan follows his instructions. It was at this point in the story where I noticed the time of day was distinctly different than it was earlier. This isn't the first Resident Evil game to do this, I'm aware, but in most Resident Evil games, you tend to only see the environments during one segment of the day or night, occasionally twice like in RE4. Village having the same exact hub area for the entire game, in this aspect, works in its favor. The series has always been rich in atmosphere from day one, but this elicits a different mood to me, one more bittersweet and melancholic, only complemented by the taunting signpost left behind by Heisenberg, leading Ethan down an enigmatic red carpet. Before we can meet Heisenberg, we're challenged to fight our way through an abandoned fortress stuffed to the brim with lichens, an entire segment dedicated to pure, unadulterated combat. At this point, I'm sure practically none of you will be surprised to hear that I have mixed feelings on this as well. To put it simply, this kind of game isn't best suited to fighting off hordes of enemies with fast-paced action. Village uses the same type of perspective and movement system as RE7, a game that was built with the intention to emulate the slow, clunky, and nerve-wracking gameplay of the original PlayStation trilogy. When you mix that slower, patience-heavy style of movement with hordes of enemies akin to the more fast-paced, action-heavy Resident Evil games, what you end up with is a hot mess. They really went overboard with the amount of lichens you end up fighting off in this place. You wind up getting swarmed from every direction, unable to properly save yourself unless you rely on mines and heavy firepower. This isn't RE4 where you have much more fluent movement and defensive options at your disposal to get yourself out of any dangerous situation with proper skill. I'm well aware that there are likely videos online of people beating this game without taking any damage. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised. But the problem lies in the player's blatant disadvantage. But what about the third-person mode? I hear some of you typing down in the comments. I'm sorry to be a negative Nancy about this, but no. The third-person camera doesn't magically fix this. You have a wider view of the environment which can help with warning you about enemy positioning, but as far as I know, the movement system is unchanged. It's nothing but a different coat of paint as far as I'm concerned. Sure, it may look nicer than the old color, but it's still the same wall. It's a similar issue I have with God of War 4, forcing a camera system designed for walk and talk set pieces into a third-person hack-and-slash series. Assuming everything is directly in front of you at all times, there isn't too much issue, because that's the direction this kind of camera is designed to constantly be pointing toward. Resident Evil Village is already trying as hard as it possibly can to live up to its older brother's legacy, so I personally think it should have been designed for third person at the very start of development. Okay, I'm done ranting about this, moving on now. After fighting through what feels like over 50 lichens, we make our way to some kind of battle arena where we finally get to fight Hagrid. This fight can also be annoying, since you're stuck in the tight corridor and Hagrid tends to summon minions to pester the fuck out of you, but overall I'd say this is one of the better boss fights in the game. It feels incredibly good to pump this hulking beast full of lead and slowly wear him down via a hailstorm of gunfire and explosives. I also like how this fight contrasts well with your first encounter with him at the beginning of the game, where you're only left alive from the sound of a bell in the distance. It's like Ethan is saying, "You made a grave mistake keeping me alive, now you're going 6 feet under." It's a minor detail, but I live for this kind of stuff in games. Eventually, after spending a good 3/4 of our ammo supply to bring this guy down, we finally kill him and advance onward, obtaining the 4th flask.
You're the real deal, Ethan. Well done.
Quit hiding, asshole. I'm not letting you get out of this.
Cool your jets. Just a little bit more, and you're all wrapped up. I'll lend you a hand. So in exchange...
In exchange what?
First of all, come to me. Put all the flasks in the altar, and I'm sure you'll figure the rest out. See you, Ethan.
God damn it.
And on we go to the final Lord's Lair. Inserting all 4 flasks into the chalice at the center of the village, we open up the pathway to Heisenberg's factory. He tells us not to worry about Rose, but the idea of Ethan just leaving his daughter's flask behind doesn't sound like the smartest idea to me. I mean, I know it's huge, but oh well, it's whatever, I guess.
I didn't think you'd make it past Daughter Moreau, but I suppose you survived worse back in America, hmm?
I don't know if that's true. I think Lady D alone could solo anything from RE7, but that's just me. Here we meet up with Heisenberg and engage in one of my personal favorite interactions in the whole game. Rather than wanting to kill Ethan, Heisenberg instead offers to work with him, stating he never wanted to be part of Miranda's family in the first place, suggesting that they save Rose and use her powers to destroy Miranda. Ethan, being the protective Papa Bear he is, promptly tells Heisenberg to fuck off, leading to him kicking us into the death pit. I love this scene for two reasons, both stemming from Heisenberg himself. For one, he's a very fun character to watch. From his very first appearance, you can tell that he stands out from the other lords, much like how Lady Dimitrescu does. He's charming, witty, and clearly out to fulfill his own agenda. His Magneto powers also amplify his cool factor tenfold. Second, this part right here.
Look, you got this all wrong. Tell me on the team.
Shut your fucking hole! Sorry about that.
The fact that there's a Resident Evil villain that just casually apologizes like this always gets a snicker out of me. I do have some gripes worth pointing out though, some more subjective than others. For one, Ethan willingly sitting on the chair placed right next to the damn hatch just screams of idiotic horror protagonist syndrome. At least move the chair over to the side a bit, I mean come on. Second, I feel like this was a missed opportunity to give the player a choice on whether to team up with Heisenberg or refuse him. RE7 did something like this and they could have easily brought it over to Village as well. So Ethan refuses Heisenberg's offer and we're kicked into the pit, this is Sparta style. The noise we heard Heisenberg yelling at a minute prior then shows itself as a literal walking engine fan with legs. We don't find out until later, but this thing is called Sturm. However, I'd prefer to call him by the nickname a friend and I came up with while streaming his playthrough of the game. Henry Helicopter. Our bullets end up being ineffective against Henry, so we're forced to run from him, jumping into a garbage chute and somehow surviving this fall without breaking our legs like twigs, transitioning in the factory level of this game. Unlike the dollhouse and lake segments of the game, the factory is up there next to the castle for arguably my favorite segment out of the main four. I may actually like it the most out of all of them. One of the simplest reasons as to why would be the aesthetic. Dark, cold, and metallic factory buildings just do a great job of making me feel uneasy. These are locations filled to the brim with dangerous, heavy equipment complemented by a very cold, musty air that reminds me of my house's basements over the years, infusing a strong, instinctual feeling of imminent danger right into my soul. The castle also had something like this in regards to the dungeons, but the factory has it for the entire level. The goal here is to make your way back up to the top floor by creating key items through these molds you find across the factory, all while dealing with Heisenberg's motivated abominations getting in your way. It's very clear to me that this is Village's attempt to replicate the Regenerator encounters from RE4. You walk into a room, see a dormant creature you know is going to wake up once you grab the key item it's guarding, you grab what you need to, and boom, spooky scary monster with big red glowy spots. Shoot it! Sadly, these guys simply do not hold a candle to the Regenerators. What I'm about to say is very subjective, but to me, these guys aren't nearly as scary as the Regenerators. The rapid breathing of the Regenerators does a great job of not only alerting you to their immediate presence, but shaking your nerves and forcing you to anticipate where they might be hiding. In addition, shooting the parasites I feel is far more nerve-wracking than just shooting the drill guy's glowing chest. Placing their weak spots in more than one location puts more pressure on the player to make their shots count. And worse yet, some Regenerators have parasites on their backs, which is only really feasible to destroy by blowing off their legs and taking a quick shot before they begin to jump and squirm. I will admit that at least a portion of my opinion is biased. I played RE4 when I was 8 or 9 years old. The game absolutely terrified me, the Regenerators especially so. Because of this, when I think of the Regenerators, a portion of my mind thinks back to how terrifying they were to 8-year-old me. That being said, I still argue they're scarier than the cyborg drill dudes. It isn't even really a contest. Moving on, the factory is now crawling with these guys all over the place, and soon we run into variants that change up how we deal with them. One has 2 drills and their weak spot is on their backside. We encounter ones that can fly around, and finally a heavily armored one that can only be damaged once you shatter their armor with explosives. I've seen quite a bit of discourse online about how these monsters overstay their welcome. It's no exaggeration when I say the game spams these things at every possible opportunity. The issue isn't that they're difficult enemies, if anything I'd argue it's the opposite, but just reusing them over and over again in such a short span of time isn't exactly engaging game design. To be perfectly honest, I can understand why some people would feel this way. It's a fair criticism. In my case though, I don't find this to be that big of a deal. A constant flow of combat keeps the gameplay engaging, and since you never really fight more than 2 of these guys at once, it doesn't fall victim to the game's stiff movement system nearly as much, unlike the Lycan Fortress. Once we make it to the top, we end up in a boss fight with Henry Helicopter, a boss fight that I think is fine. I don't really have anything to complain about, but also lack any points of praise. and this was for one reason. The fight itself is very bare bones and simple. Henry will charge at you with no strategy, ramming through and against walls before turning around and doing it again. That's it. That's 90% of the fight. Like everything else in this factory, your goal is to hit his glowing weak spot, which happens to be his rear end. You wait for him to charge and hit a wall, take a few shots, then when he turns around, you repeat the process. Once he takes enough damage, he'll begin to spew fire from his propellers, coating the floor and leaving you less room to reposition. Aside from that, it's just a matter of shooting his backside until he inevitably goes down. With Henry taken out, we make our way back to the surface, only to be stopped by Heisenberg, who turns into a transformer and sends us all the way back down to the bottom.
Damn it again!
My thoughts exactly, Ethan. Not 5 seconds after traversing through a dark room, we run into Chris Redfield.
I told you to leave it alone, Ethan. You are in the way.
What do you care, Chris? You killed my wife, you son of a bitch!
You think I killed Mia? That wasn't her. It was Miranda.
What?
She's a bioweapon. She changed her appearance and pretended to be Mia. Seems she also survived being shot, so now I'm here to finish the job.
Bullshit! Why don't you fucking tell me right away?
Because I knew you would want to be involved. And this job is hard enough without civilians getting in the way.
Why us, Chris? What the hell is going on?
All right, Ethan. All right. I guess I owe you an explanation.
And here we arrive at the biggest problem I have with Village. Chris fucking Redfield. This entire story could have easily been avoided if Chris just told Ethan what was happening from the very beginning. The crutches of this game's plot lie in blatant miscommunication from Chris, and that really gets under my skin. Miscommunication is one of the laziest ways to make a disastrous plot happen. The idea that 2 or more characters can't just take 5 minutes to explain what's going on is a trope in writing that always boils my blood whenever I see it. Okay, so let's rewind back to the opening. Chris and his men just open fire on Mia, slaughtering her right in front of Ethan. Then Chris walks in, dumps a full mag into Mia's corpse, and all he says is, "Sorry, Ethan." Ethan very blatantly asks Chris why he did this, to which he doesn't get a single response. After being moved into the foyer, Chris's men take Rose, prompting Ethan to practically jump on Chris and demand him to let her go, only for Chris to talk down to Ethan like he's a dog scratching the sofa or something.
Ethan, no.
There are a number of instances here where Chris could take 2 seconds telling Ethan that his home has been invaded and Mia is actually someone else. What makes this even more infuriating to me is something Chris says a bit later.
There wasn't time. We didn't expect Miranda to act so soon.
What do you mean there was no time? You were standing in Ethan's doorway doing absolutely nothing while one of your cronies was fetching Rose. What, were you checking your Twitter? This kills Chris as a character. He's always been a favorite among fans of the series, but to turn him into this completely idiotic meathead just eliminates a large portion of what made Chris so likable in the first place. Before I say anything else, I'm well aware why Chris tried so hard to keep Ethan out of this. He has a long, repeated history of losing his teammates since Resident Evil 5. Jill, his squad and peers from RE6, it's clear that Chris is putting every ounce of effort he can into keeping those around him out of harm's way. His method of execution, however, couldn't possibly be more foolish. Even more insulting to me is how Chris tells Ethan repeatedly to stay out of it and not get in the way, when his family was already involved from the very beginning. It's made blatantly obvious from the moment you look at the game's cover art that the intention from the very beginning is to paint Chris as one of the main antagonists, something the intro conveys very well. Obviously the reason why Chris doesn't explain anything is because, 1, it would shatter the illusion of Chris being evil from the very start, and 2, the game wouldn't have a story. Plain and simple. Another consequence of this whole mess is turning Chris into a real jerk in the way he treats Ethan throughout the game. Every single scene before he explains the situation involves Chris being quite rude to Ethan, very patronizing and strict. He comes off as an asshole. I could go on and on about how Bunch Village made me despise this version of Chris, but I think you get the idea. After Chris finally explains the situation to Ethan, he suddenly decides to team up with Ethan instead of telling him to sit in the corner because he's been a bad boy. I like how Chris tells Ethan to try and stay under the radar, while also giving him a mech equipped with a machine gun, rocket launcher, and a giant chainsaw. Yeah, sure, whatever you say, Chris.
You're like a goddamn cockroach! You think you can take me on? Fine. This will be my one before I kill that bitch. Let's say this. Man.
Okay, I'm not gonna lie, this is easily my favorite fight in the game. Look, I know this goes beyond the boundary of over-the-top action Resident Evil games typically try not to emulate like they did with RE6. And that's probably why I like it so much, because RE6 is fun as hell. That's right, I said it! That's really all it comes down to here. The battle is fun. Strafing around the arena, blocking his attacks with your chainsaw arm, and blowing him to Kingdom Come with one gigantic explosion at a time, it just feels incredible. But of course, no good thing lasts forever. The second phase of this fight involves battling Heisenberg on foot with your normal weapons, taking cover and getting in shots where you can. A very David and Goliath style fight, which I think is kinda neat. Also, a quick side note, am I the only one who finds it odd that bullets can harm this metal monstrosity? Heisenberg literally controls metal. Why can't he just make the bullets turn around and hit Ethan instead? Reverse Uno card style. Well, in any case, we deliver the final blow from the sky in one of the most ridiculous cutscenes I've ever watched. Alright Ethan, that was pretty good. I'll give you that one. With Heisenberg dead, all that remains is Mother Miranda. Inconveniently, she happens to confront Ethan right afterward. I'd play the cutscene for you guys, but to be honest, it really isn't that interesting. Just your typical villain monologue while Ethan makes angry noises. The one eyebrow-raising comment Miranda does make involves Rose being Evelyn's successor. This is a subject that's covered much more heavily in the DLC, but there are files you can find in the base game that delve into Miranda's connection to Evelyn, and why she's so obsessed with Rose. Basically, Miranda lost her daughter over a century ago to the Spanish flu. She became obsessed with trying to get her daughter back, leading to her performing experiments on people using the Cadeau. The vast majority of these test subjects turned into Lycans, and only those with higher compatibility were given special abilities, like the Four Lords. The idea was to create a vessel for her daughter using these test subjects, but none of them proved to be compatible enough. Evelyn was one of these subjects. However, she was created by the Connections, rather than Miranda herself, and clearly designed as a bioweapon rather than a vessel. How does this connect Evelyn to Rose? Well, we'll cover that shortly. So Ethan shouts at Miranda for a couple minutes until she pops out of the ground, rips out Ethan's heart, and Ethan actually dies? This was definitely a big no, that didn't just happen moment for me on my first playthrough. Resident Evil is known for a lot of things, but killing off the character you play as isn't really one of them. Well, except for Piers, I guess. So where does the game go from here? I'll be honest, I don't know how to transition from this, so I'm just gonna say it. Chris fucking Redfield. Alright, look, I know I shat all over Chris for a good chunk of this video, and I still think Village murdered his character, but getting to play as him is so goddamn cool that I couldn't give a damn. I'll enjoy this while it lasts, and then go back to hating him once it's over. This entire section is just one big power trip from beginning to end. Getting to mow down hordes of Lycans with a machine gun and grenades is way more satisfying than desperately trying to not get jumped back in that fortress. If I were to make one complaint, it's that Chris's machine gun burns through its magazines too quickly. When you have 7 or more Lycans rushing you down at once with very few steps to take, having to reload constantly can lead to you taking cheap shots like no tomorrow, which is especially frustrating on higher difficulties. As much as I enjoy this segment, I've heard a lot of people criticize it for being too action heavy. RE6 vibes, basically. I understand where this criticism comes from, but I feel like it being quite short prevents it from overstaying its welcome. In a way, this is RE8's version of the ship from RE7, only it's the polar opposite. The ship level is slow and dull, while playing as Chris is way too over the top. The two extremes of Resident Evil, really. As someone who likes both the horror and action Resident Evil games, I didn't have much of an issue with either of these, although I understand why most people would disagree. To me, I personally like this more than the ship, and it's for one simple reason. I love Chris's Hound Wolf Squad. They may not be in the game for very long, but just their lines alone add so much character in so little time. I believe one of the files you can read after beating the game explains that Chris created the Hound Wolf Squad after losing trust in the BSAA for covering up the Baker incident from RE7. So Chris and his crew essentially work outside the BSAA, something the latter was very displeased with. It's a small touch, but the idea of Chris making his own team after working with the BSAA for years is such a badass concept to me. To many of you, I'm sure this sounds like such a trivial thing to give so much praise to, but sometimes it's the little things that make the biggest impact on me.
So if Miranda was the fake Mia, where's the real one? I doubt she saw any further use for her. I don't get any of this. How did Miranda even know Rose exists?
A moldy little bird told her, maybe?
We can figure that out later. Focus on the plan.
After blowing up whatever this is supposed to be, we venture underground and come face to face with Super Hagrid. This fight is really silly to me. The idea that Chris can go toe to toe with this giant meat wall, wielding a humongous spiked mace that he can block with his gun, mind you, is honestly incredible, in both a ridiculous and badass way. The goal here is to hit Super Hagrid with 3 Predator missiles until he goes down. Each time you land a hit, you gotta wait for it to cool down before you can fire a follow-up shot, which basically means just surviving for a minute as best you can. Eventually you kill him, and then Chris ventures further underground, all while his teammates ask the questions that the players are no doubt itching to know themselves. Locating the Mega Mycete, Chris javelin throws a stick of explosives into the gooey mold hive mind, ready to blow the village to Kingdom Come. Oh, and just in case you think I'm wrong about Chris not telling Ethan the plan, listen to this.
I know it's too late now, but we really should have told Ethan the plan.
There wasn't time. We didn't expect Miranda to act so soon.
Even so, you should have told him.
Yeah.
It's almost as if the writers knew this plot point was weak as hell, but they're too far in development to do a rewrite and fix it. So they just said fuck it, and basically admitted through one of the NPCs that they fucked up. Also, Chris, what do you mean you didn't have time? You were standing in Ethan's foyer just waiting for your men to escort him. How much time does it take to tell him, that isn't the real Mia, your home is compromised? 3 seconds? At most? Anyway. Chris winds up in Miranda's lab, where we can find like a dozen files filled with lore. Most of what I explained earlier relating to Miranda's backstory, her experiments with the mold, and how creatures like the Lycans and Four Lords came to be, come from this room. What stuck out the most to me, though, is a letter on one of the tables addressed to Miranda, a letter that happens to be from Oswell E. Spencer of all people. As it turns out, Spencer met with Miranda about a decade or so before he created the progenitor virus, and the two of them seem to be on good terms. I have mixed feelings about sneaking Spencer into the story, because part of me feels like it's a bit forced, just something to tickle the fans' nostalgia and not much more, but I find the contrast between them to be quite fascinating. While Miranda utilized mold, Spencer utilized a virus. Miranda aimed to resurrect a single person, while Spencer aimed to change the world. It's also explained that Spencer got the idea for the umbrella logo from the symbol present where you place the giant's chalice. Overall, I still think this feels a bit forced, but it doesn't hurt the series with its presence, I don't think. After getting our fill of exposition, we open the cell in Miranda's lab to find... Mia?
Show me your hands! Umbrise, this is Alpha. Where is Miranda right now?
Still at the ceremony site. Whatever she's doing, she's staying put.
God damn. It really is you. I'm glad you're safe, Mia. Why are you here?
I was caught in Houston experiments.
Wait, did you say Mia? Mia Winters?
In the flesh.
Yeah, so as it turns out, Mia is actually alive. I cannot exaggerate how relieved I felt when I saw this. Chris revealing that he actually shot Miranda back at the house was one big weight off my shoulders, but much like how one of his squad mates pointed out earlier, that left the question of where the real Mia was. After going through hell and back to save her in the previous game, I would have been bitter as hell if they actually killed her off. Understandably, Mia is quite upset with Chris for not keeping his promise on keeping their family safe. Chris breaks the news to Mia that Ethan was killed, and her answer is interesting.
No! You're wrong. I tried to keep this a secret, but... you don't understand how special he is.
The scene shifts to Ethan in a sub-zero field surrounded by mist. This cutscene goes on forever, so I'll just summarize the big lore bombs. A projection of Evelyn explains to Ethan that he's dead, but not because of Miranda. As it turns out, Ethan has been dead since he visited the Baker house 4 years ago. As soon as Jack stomped Ethan's face in, that's where he met his end. From that point onward, Ethan has been kept alive by mold, the same mold that infected the Bakers and the creatures in the village. Essentially, Ethan is a walking mold zombie, and that mold is present in his daughter. This fungus possesses a gigantic hive mind, and while Evelyn was killed in the previous game, her essence is still present wherever the mold resides. As a result, Rose is basically a reincarnation of Evelyn. Even in death, Ethan is determined to save Rose, and by some miracle, he's able to resurrect. Ethan wakes up in the back of Duke's caravan, who had picked Ethan up after his supposed death. I'd always found Duke to be a very fun character. He has so much more of a personality than the Merchant from RE4, and while I love the Merchant, don't get me wrong, I honestly think Duke has him beat. Wow. Never thought I'd actually say there's something this game does better than RE4, but that's how it goes, I guess. Buying the last of our supplies and upgrades, it's time for the final battle with Miranda. I'd say this is easily the most mechanically engaging fight in the game. I'd argue it's one of the stronger final boss fights in the series in regards to theming. Two parents fighting over possession of their child, a child with more than one spirit. This is the kind of plot you'd see in a badass anime, and I'm all for it. Ethan's pissed off comments towards Miranda is the icing on the cake here. This man cheated death twice, trying to save his family from these infected lunatics, and you can hear how done he is with everybody's shit.
How can you deny me? Why the hell didn't you realize Rose is my goddamn kid, not yours?
Pumping this bitch full of magnum rounds, we deliver the final blow and finally save Rose, but this victory comes with a price. With Rose finally saved and Miranda exterminated, Ethan's body finally begins to deteriorate. Chris does his best to escort Ethan and Rose to the chopper so that they can escape, but Ethan knows what's coming. He takes the trigger from Chris and entrusts Rose to him, telling him to teach her to be strong before saying his goodbyes.
Goodbye, Rosemary.
Ethan.
What was that?
I told you to sit down.
Where is he? Chris? What have you done?
He's gone. I tried. He stayed so we could all escape. I'm sorry.
Captain, you need to see this. BSAA didn't send soldiers. This is a bioweapon.
What the hell were they thinking?
Orders, Captain.
Pick up the rest of the squad. Plot a course for BSAA Europe HQ. Someone's gotta pay.
What a powerful ending to such a polarizing game. For those of you who have listened to me ramble up to this point, thank you for watching. But for those of you who decided to skip my yapping so you could hear the short version, let me get right on that. The reason Resident Evil Village is disappointing boils down to three major points: bad story, lackluster mechanics, and lack of identity. Overall, I feel like Village has a very strong foundation for a story. The skeleton is there, but the flesh surrounding it is what utterly ruins the plot. I like the idea of Chris being a pseudo-antagonist. I like the idea of continuing Ethan and Mia's story from 7. I like a lot of the ideas Village puts on the table, but none of these ideas matter at all when the story is built around Chris not explaining anything to Ethan until about 4/5 of the way through the game. This is largely going to boil down to personal opinion, but in my eyes, if your story can only happen from characters not communicating, it makes for a bad story more often than not. I absolutely loathe miscommunication, both in and outside of stories, no matter how genuine or selfless the intentions of the ones responsible. There are many people in the community who feel like this isn't a big deal, and Chris did what was best for the safety of Ethan and his family. To be honest, if you like the story in Village, then more power to you. My intention here isn't to say anyone is wrong. Are you familiar with the quote from John Carmack? Story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important. For years, I always viewed that quote as very close-minded. I've played tons of games with amazing, incredible stories. Stories that I'll never forget. Stories that have changed my life for the better and inspired me to become a writer. To essentially say that video game stories don't matter that much was a bit insulting to me. Then I played a game called Borderlands 3. For any of you familiar with the Borderlands games, you all immediately know where I'm going with this. But for those of you who aren't in the loop, Borderlands 3 is considered to be one of, if not the worst game in the series for one key reason: the story. I won't go into the specifics of this game's plot because that's a topic for another day, but so many people in the Borderlands community either hate or have mixed feelings about this game. A lot of this controversy stems from one of the game's protagonists, Ava. To a lot of people, Ava is an annoying brat that always whines and complains like a spoiled teenager at every possible opportunity. That on its own would already be bad enough for some, but Borderlands 3 goes the extra mile by introducing a bunch of annoying characters on top of killing off fan favorites. This ruined the game for a lot of people, but I really didn't think much of it on my first playthrough, partly because 3 was the first game in the series that I finished, but also because the actual gameplay is some of the best I've ever experienced in a first-person shooter. I can honestly excuse the bad story and characters because the gameplay is rock solid, but this is a very subjective point from person to person. I can forgive the bad story in Borderlands 3, but I can't excuse it in Resident Evil Village. So why is that the case? Well, because of the lackluster mechanics. Village tries so hard to emulate mechanics from RE4, but falls flat on its face every single time. The biggest culprit for this is the weapon progression system. Throughout the game, you'll find a bunch of different firearms to try out and spend your currency on to upgrade and fine-tune to your liking. This was one of the best mechanics introduced in RE4, as it added a layer of customization and personalization to the player's loadout. You could arm yourself with whatever weapon configurations you felt like and get a new gameplay experience every time you gave a new weapon a spin. While you can still technically do this in Village, the experience is far more bland and uninteresting when compared to 4. See, Village's weapons all follow a rising scale of power, meaning the weapons you find in the early game will eventually become outclassed after you find their replacements later on. With a few minor exceptions, these replacement weapons are unequivocally superior to your old guns in almost every stat. This means pouring your hard-earned cash into upgrading the early game weapons is an impractical investment. Sure, you may make things slightly easier for yourself until you eventually find a better gun, but the far more optimal way to play is to just spend your money on other things in the shop, or save so you can upgrade the endgame weapons. This is somewhat applicable to RE4 to an extent, but the level of diversity in that game far outweighs any cases of obsolete weapons. Off the top of my head, the only gun in RE4 that you should never bother upgrading because it has a blatantly superior alternative is the base shotgun. I know a lot of you will argue that the base rifle also falls into this category, but when fully upgraded, its firepower is double that of the semi-auto rifle, which can really make a difference in some boss fights, on top of saving you rifle ammo. In fact, while we're on the topic of max upgrades, that's another missing piece of the puzzle that Village really could have used: the exclusive upgrades. Once you've purchased every single upgrade for a gun in RE4, you then unlock that weapon's exclusive upgrade, which is essentially one final bonus, to truly maximize the firearm's power. Some guns just get a beefy upgrade to firepower, but others get much more unique perks, such as a 5x boost to critical hit chance, or being able to shoot through 5 enemies at once. This made weapons like the Punisher hold its own when in comparison to the other pistols. Ask anyone who played RE4 what their favorite pistol is in-game, and they'll likely tell you it's the Blacktail or Red 9, because they have incredible stopping power. A lot of people push the handgun and Punisher off to the side because they hit like feathers in comparison, but the handgun is the cheapest pistol to upgrade and gets the 5x critical hit bonus, which allows it to pop heads left and right. The Punisher is statistically the weakest pistol, but its ability to penetrate through enemies makes it an ideal weapon to use against enemies with shields or hordes. What I'm getting at here is that almost every weapon in RE4 is viable throughout the entirety of the game, while most of the firearms in Village become obsolete once you find the next variant. There's no point holding onto the base pistol and shotgun in Village aside from a self-imposed challenge, and that's boring to me. Village put so much effort into trying to replicate what made RE4 so special, which leads me to my third and final point. As I mentioned previously, Village desperately tries to replicate themes and mechanics from RE4 to the point of tedium. For various reasons, most of these attempts at emulation either completely fall flat or just don't reach the same level of adequacy. I already mentioned the weapon progression system, but it goes far deeper. The game's hub being centered around a village, a previous untrained protagonist returns in an effort to save someone who's been kidnapped. While taking advantage of their newfound skills, you get swarmed upon entering the village, find a shotgun in the nearby house, and are saved by the ring of a bell. There's a castle, lake, and factory level. You meet a charming merchant. I could go on and on and on. It's no secret to anybody that RE4 is the most beloved game in the franchise, and Capcom knows this. There's nothing wrong with reusing elements from a previous game when making a new one. There are plenty of examples of games that do this very well. The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is said to be one of the greatest Zelda games, and/or just one of the best games ever made, period. Any game that followed Ocarina was inevitably going to replicate what made it so good in the first place. The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess copies a lot of elements from Ocarina, and a lot of people view it as Ocarina's potential fully realized. You start out in a village in the woods, go through a forest, fire, and water temple, get the Master Sword, do a bunch more dungeons, and then finally take down Ganondorf. The core of the game's plot and mechanics are nearly identical to how Ocarina is structured. It's just that the filling is swapped out with a mostly original story that just borrows from Ocarina's foundation. Whether or not you think Twilight Princess is blatantly superior to Ocarina or not is up to your own interpretation, but in my opinion, Twilight Princess doesn't render Ocarina obsolete, and vice versa. I can still play both games and enjoy them equally for different reasons. Unlike Twilight Princess, however, Village's attempt at borrowing elements from RE4 doesn't work because it butchers what made the latter so enjoyable in the first place. Aside from Heisenberg, there's no fun villains, the weapon progression system is horrible, the game's movement system isn't designed to work in a more action-focused style of gameplay, and the rewarding gameplay loop just doesn't match up to its older brother. Instead of trying to be just like its older sibling, Village should have just stuck to what it did best and be its own game. Plain and simple.